everyone, I am Marie Walker, the director of the Ada Mae Ivester Education Center here at the Northeast Georgia History Center, and today I'm going to tell you about the life of Mother Mathilda Beasley. Mother Mathilda Beasley was born just Mathilda Taylor, and she was born into slavery in New Orleans. Well, at least we think she was. It is possible that her mother and her were enslaved, but her early life is very fuzzy on the historical record, but we believe that she was probably born on November 14th, 1832, or it could have been 1834. There are a couple places where records differ, but it was definitely in the 1830s, early 1830s. Her mother's name was Caroline, and she was a French Creole woman who, again, we believe was most likely enslaved. It looks like she was owned by a man named James C. Taylor, and we are unsure who Mathilda's father was. Some accounts point to it possibly being James C. Taylor. Mathilda did have the last name Taylor until she married, so that could have pointed to James C. Taylor being her father. Other times, enslaved people, when leaving enslavement, did take on the name of their enslaver, the last name of their enslaver, just because they did not have a last name, and therefore they needed one, and that seemed to be a convenient last name to pull from, as it was part of their history, albeit a terrible one. But also, some historians point to Mathilda's father being a Native American man that lived within the area, but are not sure necessarily if that is true or not. So it also is unclear what Mathilda or Caroline's roles while enslaved were. They could have been enslaved on a plantation or in an urban area of New Orleans. But some historians also speculate that Mathilda became an orphan at an early age, and she might have spent some time at a Catholic orphanage in New Orleans. Now, another very interesting thing that I am most generally intrigued by, that we do not have answers for, is how or why she obtained her freedom from enslavement, if she was indeed enslaved, which it looks like she was. And that's really an interesting thing because we are not sure why, but it seems like she either bought her own freedom or she was gifted her freedom. We aren't sure how or why she obtained her freedom, but we do know that she made her way to Savannah, Georgia in the 1850s. And since she went from New Orleans to Savannah, Georgia, those are two places in the South where slavery was indeed legal, that points to her not being a runaway or self-liberated enslaved person. Instead, it suggests that she purchased or was gifted her freedom. She was a free person living in the South, a free person of color living in the South. And we know that for sure. So that's one indication of that she was either purchased her freedom or was gifted it. So as she went to go live in Savannah, there was also a population of 705 free people of color in Savannah listed in the 1860s census. So we can assume that in the 1850s, it's about that same number of people as well. So these free persons of color, they were forced to actually wear identifying badges to say that they were indeed free people of color. Free women and men of color did a lot of jobs, a lot of different trade jobs that were often equated to what poor white people would have done at the same time. So Mathilda Beasley, as a free woman of color, would have done a lot of the same things as a poor white woman would have done. And that would have been like a laundress or a seamstress, domestic help, and cooks. And in the 1860 census, Mathilda Beasley is listed as working as a seamstress. So that is what she did to make her living. She was a seamstress. So this is a skill. Sewing is a skill, which points to her having learned that probably back in New Orleans, that she would have learned how to sew. Generally, that is something that not a enslaved field hand would have learned how to do. So that points to her probably working within a house context. Now, what I think is most interesting here is she ran a secret school for free and enslaved Black children. If she ran a school teaching people how to read and write, that means that she herself had to learn how to read and write. And I'm interested to see who taught her, who taught Mathilda how to read and write, because that was illegal. But in New Orleans, the rules, they have a little bit of a different bend on them because of the French and Spanish colonization before America took control in the early 1800s with the Louisiana Purchase. And the rules about slavery from Spain and from France were different than rules that English colonies had and America had about enslavement, which is a very interesting social constructs that they have about that. But while while we do not know who taught Matilda how to read and write or where she received her education, we do know that from the 1850s to 1860s, she taught at a secret school from the 1850s to 1860s, where she taught free and enslaved Black children to read and write at a time where it was illegal to do so. She could have gotten in trouble. And it was not just illegal for a Black woman or a Black man to teach Black children. It was also illegal for a white teacher to teach Black children at that time. So she could have definitely been punished if the wrong people were to have found out about the secret school that she was having in her home. And that punishment for her, for Black teachers who were teaching Black enslaved children or even Black free children at the time to read and write, was a fine of $100 and up to 32 lashes with a whip in the public square. Now, white teachers, for doing the same offense, they would have just had to pay a fine of $500 and there would have been no chance of whippings. That was not something that was on the table for white educators. But the education of these children that Matilda Beasley participated in, these quote unquote secret schools, they were more or less an open secret. It would be probably a good way to describe these schools. It looks like there might have been 6 or 7 of these illegal schools for enslaved children in the 1860s in Savannah. And of course, we are not super sure because they were an open secret, meaning that people knew about them, but you still don't want to have documentation of it. And teachers and students still had to take precautions. So students, they would hide their books on their way to school. They would wrap them in newspapers so people didn't see them as they were walking to school, or they would hide their books in baskets and then cover them with fuel chips. Some students, they also had to change their routes to and from school, so it didn't look like all of these children were just going to this one person's house every single day. These secret schools also often had hiding places in them just in case they were raided by authorities. So we do not know much more about Matilda Beasley's work within the secret school context, other than we know that it did occur. So not only was she a teacher and a seamstress, she also worked at a restaurant on Bryan Street in Savannah. And we know that she worked at this restaurant because her name was listed in an ad for this restaurant in 1865. The restaurant was called Railroad House, and this restaurant at which she worked was owned by a man named Abraham Beasley, who was a wealthy, free Black man in Savannah. As well as owning this restaurant, he also owned land, a produce market, and a saloon, as well as a boarding house. So this is a man of some means, but he didn't just earn his money from all of these businesses that he ran. He also earned some of his money from the slave trade, which is a very interesting, complex thing to look at because he is a free Black man who is also participating in the slave trade. It does not look like he himself owned slaves or owned enslaved individuals, but he definitely earned some of his money in the slave trade. There's lots of different ways that businesses were affected by the slave trade. We are not necessarily sure exactly how he participated, but it does seem to be that he did indeed get some of this money that he then used to open these different businesses from participating in some part of the slave trade. Now we can assume that Matilda met Abraham Beasley when she was working at his restaurant, and then we can assume that they fell in love because soon after we see her starting to work at this restaurant, they married. So in 1869, Matilda, at this time she's still Matilda Taylor, she was baptized at St. John the Baptist Cathedral. And this was probably in preparation for her marriage to Abraham Beasley because they were then married on February 9th, 1869. Matilda and Abraham Beasley then lived at a house on 48 Harris Street, and they did not have any children of their own, but Abraham, he had a son who was also named Abraham from a previous marriage, his first marriage. So they did have a a son that was living with them at the time, but it was not one that was produced from their union. Matilda and Abraham remained married until Abraham's death on September 3rd, 1877, and he was then buried in Savannah's Catholic Cemetery on Wheaton Street. Abraham left all of his money, property, and businesses to Matilda, so she became a very wealthy widow, but she didn't want to keep the money. She turned around and donated all of her wealth to the Roman Catholic Church. Some historians theorize that she possibly donated this wealth to the church as a way to atone for her husband's sins of making this money that was then used to make even more money from the slave trade. But there is no documents that point specifically to that. That is just very much a historian's theory, which seems rather plausible. So no, we are not exactly sure how Matilda first became a Catholic, because at this point in her life, once her husband dies and she donates all of her money to the Catholic Church, she becomes incredibly invested in the Catholic Church. So there are lots of different theories about how she came to the Catholic faith. One is that she is from New Orleans, which is a city that has a very strong influence of French and Spanish Catholicism from the time time when it was colonized by the French and the Spanish. So it's a city in the South, which is a rather rare thing, that has a very, very strong ties to the Catholic Church rather than Protestant or Anglican ties. She was probably always aware of Catholicism, but we don't know when she necessarily accepted that faith or when she learned about it and decided to follow it herself. So she could have acquired it at a young age. The family that owned her and her mother could have been Catholics and therefore encouraged the Catholic faith to those that they had enslaved. She could have also spent time at a Catholic orphanage after her mother's death. That's another theory about when she possibly came to learn more about the Catholic faith. But from what documents that we have point to, it looks like she became a Catholic at the time when she married Abraham Beasley, because that's the time when she was baptized into the Catholic Church before she was married in the Catholic Church to Abraham. So it looks like Abraham himself indeed was Catholic, wanted to have a Catholic wedding and Catholic marriage because that's a sacrament within the Catholic Church. So therefore had his wife not necessarily convert, but at least baptize and express that she accepted that faith so that they could then be married. But regardless of how she came to the Catholic faith, it is very obvious that from the point of her husband's death onward, and probably even before her husband's death, I really think it happened at the time when she married Abraham, it looks like she very much at that point wholeheartedly embraced her Catholic faith and very much dedicated her life to serving the church. And I mean, she gave the Roman Catholic Church all of her money that she had inherited upon her husband's death. That's a pretty big commitment, an act of service to the church. But she didn't just give the money without any stipulations. She had specific requests, and basically what she had requested was that part of the funds be used for a home for African American orphans within Savannah. And this is also at the time, at her husband's death, that she decided to become a nun. And in 1885, Matilda entered a Franciscan nunnery in York, England, and that's where she began to train as a novice. And we aren't exactly sure why she decided to go all the way to York, England. One theory is that in the November of 1884, there was a group of Franciscan nuns who arrived in Savannah to work with the African Americans on Skidaway Island. And these nuns were from an order called the Poor Clares, which is the second order of the Franciscan orders. And it looks like one of the nuns that was a part of this group that had come to Savannah had been a member of that order in York. We also know that Matilda's husband Abraham owned property on Skidaway Island. That was one of his holdings. And we know from correspondence that Mathilda had spent time on that property on Skidaway Island. So while we do not have evidence that Mathilda met these nuns, we do have circumstantial evidence that points to where they could have been at the same place at the same time and therefore could have met. And for someone who wants to be a nun and then decide to go to this very specific place in York, England to do that, it seems like it's a rather perhaps in our historian's view obvious that she met with this nun and then they had developed some type of friendship, so that then she went to this nunnery in York, England, to where she then took her vows to become a nun. And that is indeed, we aren't sure how she necessarily decided to go to York, but we do know that she went to York, she trained to become a nun, and then she took her vows to become a nun while in York. But she did not stay in York, England. Instead, she returned to Savannah after taking her vows as a nun, and then she helped establish that orphanage for African American children that she had requested some of the funds from her husband's estate go towards. So this orphanage for African American children that she comes back and helps establish was located near the 31st and 32nd Streets and near Habersham Street as well. The street names and numbers in Savannah have changed since the 1800s, so trying to go back and locate some things exactly is rather difficult. But we do know that the orphanage was named St. Francis Home for Colored Orphans. And the first orphans arrived at this orphanage in the spring of 1887. And this is another interesting feature of the orphanage, was not only was it the first home for African American children in Savannah, well, first orphanage home for African American children in Savannah, but this orphanage was specifically to serve Black girls. Now, in 1889, Mathilda formed the first community of African American nuns in Georgia. Now, I keep saying the word Franciscan, so some people might be wondering exactly what that is. So, members of the Franciscan order are members of an order or any order founded in the early 13th century by St. Francis of Assisi, one of the early saints in the Catholic Church. And members of the Franciscan orders, they strive to promote the values of poverty and charity, therefore serving their community and not taking anything from their community, just to serve their community. They take vows of poverty, so therefore they do not try to earn anything from their good works. And it's at this time when Mathilda begins to really form this community of African American nuns in Georgia that she gets the title Mother Mathilda and then Mother Beasley. And mother being a title generally given to a senior nun in order. So as she sets up this order, she is the senior nun. Therefore, she gets the title of mother. And this group that she sets up, they then go on to operate the orphanage for several years. But the orphanage, it was constantly underfunded and understaffed. So in 1895, there were actually even several attempts to burn the orphanage down. And it's not sure who attempted to start the fires. Some blame a few teenage girls who were living at the orphanage, but that was just one of the rather large issues that this orphanage was facing. Mother Mathilda Beasley, of course, was doing her best, but the orphanage was facing a lot of problems. And in the late 1890s, the orphanage actually had to move locations to East Broad Street. The orphanage then shared the site with St. Benedict's Parish Church, and both the church and the orphanage were very much of service to the African American population in Savannah, and pretty much entirely just served the African American community. But of course, we're almost to the turn of the last century here. Mother Mathilda Beasley was very much growing older, and she needed much more help running the orphanage. So in 1898, 3 Franciscan sisters came to help her, and this is when Mother Mathilda's original group of African American nuns disbanded. And then when these other Franciscan sisters came to really take over the orphanage because Mother Matilda Beasley was just really reaching an age where she could no longer healthily run it herself. She then moved out of the orphanage and really kind of enjoyed a type of retirement. Of course, she did not stop serving her community. She just had to kind of take a step back because she was getting rather old. So, as Mother Matilda moved out of the orphanage, she then moved into this cottage that the Sacred Heart Church gave her that was located at 1511 Price Street. And it was in this cottage where she continued to work at the orphanage. She was just no longer running it. So, it was not as stressful. And then she would also take in sewing, very much going back to her roots in her early days of working in Savannah, of being a seamstress. And she would take in this sewing work, and then she would give the money that she earned from her sewing to those in need and to the orphanage. And she did this until her death. She died on December 20th, 1903. And it was reported that she was engaged in devotions in her private chapel in her cottage at the time of her death. And it looks very much like she knew that her time was coming, that she knew it was time for her to depart this world, because when her body was found, located next to it were her burial clothes, her will, and instructions for her funeral. There were many people of different backgrounds who attended her funeral mass. There were Protestants and Catholics, blacks and whites, all coming together to honor this woman. The Savannah Morning News reported that there were actually no available seats in the entire church for the service, and she actually had requested that no one eulogize her during her funeral mass. That it was just to be another mass in which it was her funeral, but she was not to be eulogized. She didn't want people to talk about her good works at that time during the mass. But the newspapers, well, she said nothing about being eulogized in the newspaper. So the Savannah Morning News wrote a beautiful article about her, and I'm going to quote a part of that now, which says, "Protestants speak in the highest terms of her life and character, and among the Negroes the feeling prevails that they have lost their truest friend and benefactor." Um, so the community mourned her loss, and she was honored in the press. Another newspaper went on to call her the idol of the poor, especially among the Negroes. She was just held in such high esteem. And then after her funeral, she was laid to rest at Savannah's Catholic Cemetery on Wheaton Street, the same one that her husband was buried in. Mother Matilda Beasley's legacy continues to this day. The Sacred Heart Church established the Mother Matilda Beasley Society in her honor, which promotes charitable programs and also raises awareness of African American contributions to the Roman Catholic Church. Mother Matilda Beasley's home, where she spent her final days, and was that cottage that was given to her by the Sacred Heart Church, has been preserved and is actually being worked on to be made into a museum with panels so that people can kind of use that space to better understand her life. And but that's not all. The city of Savannah also dedicated a park in memory of Mother Matilda in 1982. And this park includes basketball courts, a baseball field, and playgrounds for the community to enjoy. There's also a historical marker which recounts her many accomplishments. And then in 2004, she was inducted into the Georgia Women's Hall of Fame for being the amazing woman that she is. I really hope you enjoyed this program about this remarkable woman who does not have perhaps as much written about her and as much praise given to her as perhaps she deserves, but perhaps that's how she wants it, given that her final instructions were not to eulogize her, but to really have her actions point to the higher power that she served. But in this documentary, we still want to highlight her accomplishments and what she did, and perhaps in that way still honor her and her wishes by showing what she did for others. So we honor Mother Matilda Beasley during this program as we look at her incredible life and try to get her story out there more, because she was a really remarkable woman. So thank you so much for watching this program. We hope that you enjoyed learning more about Georgia's own history and some of its Catholic history as well. And thank you so much for being a member of the Northeast Georgia History Center. We truly appreciate it. And until next time, take care.